Just to give you guys an idea of where I am today, this morning, kind of by surprise, I found out that I am pregnant. I did not expect this. I have been trying to get pregnant for over a year now, with absolutely no success. And the very last thing that I expected to happen this morning was to see those two little lines on the pregnancy test. I didn't think that was going to happen. So I've been kind of getting through the entire day in like this daze of surreal denial, where I can't quite convince myself that I am actually pregnant. I've spent the last like 6 months or so trying to mentally prepare myself for the day that the doctor looks me in the eye and says, "I'm very sorry. After the procedure you had, there was some scarring and you are not likely to be able to carry a child to term or even to conceive or anything like that." I was expecting that. I was ready for that. I was not ready to see the two little lines on the pregnancy test. So, yeah. Is this baby going to live? I have no idea. Is this baby going to have a fatal disease like his brother did? Maybe. I don't know. It's way too early for me to be able to feel anything, and usually the way you feel is kind of the first warning you get. Like with that pregnancy, I could feel that something was not right. And anytime I mentioned some of the unusual things that were happening, people always said, "Oh, well, that's good." It's like, yeah, but it's not. Something just feels off. So far, I don't feel any pregnancy symptoms, but I don't feel any absence of pregnancy symptoms. I don't feel anything. I have no idea. I have a strange craving for vinegar. I have been literally drinking vinegar, which, now that I think about it, probably should have warned me that I was a little bit knocked up. Other than that, I have no idea. So, yeah, I would love to have a baby. I've wanted to have a baby. I really wanted to have a baby, but I was also very convinced that I was not going to have a baby. And I have no idea if I'm going to have a baby even now that I've gotten pregnant, because just because you can get pregnant doesn't mean you get to have the baby. So that's where I am this morning. Let's review a book, shall we? The term nice guy is actually a misnomer because nice guys are often anything but nice. I've really only ever had one honest to goodness nice guy experience, and it wasn't like a full nice guy experience, or at least for me, I don't think I realized it was getting the nice guy experience until I was breaking up with the dude. So there was this guy, he and his sister was a dancer at this club that hired me, and he and his sister really went out of their way to make sure that I felt welcomed and comfortable in this new club that I got hired into. And he was this fun guy that used to hang out at the clubs I worked at, and so I just knew him as a fun kind of customer guy. He was a little bit, he had a very unrestrained, kind of playful, wild sense of humor. He used to dye his hair in crazy colors and just kind of didn't seem to really care about what people thought of him, which it definitely doesn't fit the nice guy profile. And he and his sister were both very, very kind to me. They introduced me to the other girls at the new club when I came there. They introduced me to the bouncer, whom his sister was dating. We all ended up hanging out a lot. And, he'd take me out for dinner with them. He or his sister were always like paying for dinner for me, which was like really, really nice. And they didn't need to do that, but they did. And at some point, his friends started kind of hinting to me that he wanted to date me and that he really liked me. And that hadn't been something that had occurred to me up until that point. And I kind of looked and I was like, okay, I'm not remotely attracted to this guy, but then again, I'm not really attracted to anybody. And he's at least fun to hang out with, which is something that I can't necessarily say about everybody in this town. So, maybe I should give it a shot, and I did. And he wasn't your classical, stereotypical nice guy. He was really kind of a bastard. He was extremely Machiavellian. He was openly Machiavellian. And then he also liked starting bar fights, but he would only do it after he'd gotten some really big, burly, like vicious looking guys around him to hang out with him. So he'd go out drinking with all his buddies who were big, strong, fighting type dudes. And then he'd pick out a fight with somebody, and he was an intelligent guy, so he knew just the way to do it so that it didn't look like he was planning anything. He'd insult them just enough so that, eventually they'd decide they wanted to fight him. The moment one of them threw a punch, all of a sudden his group of guys was fighting their group of guys. If the cops ever showed up, well, they threw the first punch. I mean, he had a system, and it was pretty sick and twisted that he would go out to bars and pick fights with people because that's what he thought was fun. And that and a lot of other things, like as I dated him and got to know him better, I realized he was really, really not a nice person. And so I looked at it and was like, I don't want to be with you. And so I broke up with him. And then he didn't understand why. I had been dating an alcoholic. I've talked about the alcoholic that I dated in a few of my videos, who was also, not a great person. He was a good person, except when he was drinking, and he was always drinking. So he really wasn't a good person after all. And I went back to the alcoholic because at least he was moderately good looking. And that kind of set the idea in this guy's mind, because I'd been dating the alcoholic before him, and then after I dated him, I went back to the alcoholic, who was too drunk to really give much of a shit anyway. It set this idea in his mind that I was going back to my jerk boyfriend, who admittedly was kind of a jerk, but not nearly as much of a jerk as my nice guy boyfriend, and that women always gravitate to jerks. And so here I was following this pattern that he'd heard about, that he believed in, that he's heard the lore of, that women are always attracted to jerks and assholes, and they never really want a nice guy like him. And I remember when he told me that, as I was around the time that I broke up with him, and I just kind of was floored by that, because he wasn't a nice guy. And the idea that he thought he was a nice guy kind of threw me for a loop, because he did all this nasty shit. He wasn't a nice person. Like, he wasn't even a good person. He was a manipulative asshole. It is not unusual for unsuspecting people to mistake the passive, pleasing, and generous characteristics of a nice guy for those of a healthy male. I think this was a very important thing for him to say. I think this was when I read this sentence, it really struck me. I think there are times that girls will date guys because they think they're actually good guys. And, in this book, Glover kind of describes the same situation that Tomasi describes, but it's kind of from a different perspective. So Tomasi used to talk about how, women would ride the Cock Carousel, and they'd date a bunch of bad boys because bad boys were exciting and hypergamously pleasing, and then they'd find some nice guy, and then they'd give the line like, oh, I've never met a guy like you. I've never dated a guy like you before. In Glover's book, women are so used to encountering men who are just kind of assholes, and eventually they find a nice guy. And he seems like a rare, exceptional guy. He seems like the thing they're actually looking for. And so they're like, wow, I've never dated a guy like you. And they don't realize that there's all these strings attached to his nice behavior. And so at some point, they break up with him, and he feels used and dissatisfied. And what he doesn't realize necessarily is that he was just being nice to her to get stuff from her. And at some point, she figured it out. And so it's a very interesting, I honestly think that both sides of that story are true. I think the Cock Carousel side, where the girl, there are plenty of situations where girls have been dating bad boy after bad boy after bad boy because, ooh, it's exciting and titillating. And then at some point they're like, okay, I need a boyfriend. And they just kind of settle for some guy who's boring. Because I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen firsthand. I've seen girls tell me about their experiences doing exactly that. It happens. But not all women do that. Yes, that's a Naywald argument. I'm very tired of avoiding Naywald arguments because they exist and they are real and they need to be taken into consideration. And certainly not avoided or shut down just because they happen to be inconvenient. Not all women are doing that. some women are dating around and they're frustrated because they dated this guy and he turns out to be an asshole. And then they go date some other guy and he turns out to be an asshole. And they go date some other guy and they're really hoping for some guy somewhere along the way who is not going to be a raging asshole. And they find a nice guy and they're like, I've never dated anyone like you before. And they're really excited because they think, finally. And then he ends up being, well, not so nice after all. That happens too. And it's not, I slept with this guy and he was a raging asshole, so I slept with this guy and he was a raging asshole. It's not the hypergamously pleasing, titillating, Cock Carousel adventure ride that you might be thinking it is. It's literally going out and seeking a mate and having one after another unsuccessful attempt at finding a mate. There might or might not be Cock Carousel behavior involved. And that's something I think to take into consideration. Not every woman out there is having a party. And so that could be where the I've never dated a guy like you kind of line comes from as well. It's not always I'm settling for you because you're boring. It might be, oh, thank God, finally. The integrated male. He has a strong sense of self. He is comfortable with his masculinity and his sexuality. He has integrity. He does what is right, not what is expedient. He knows how to set boundaries and is not afraid to work through conflict. When Tomasi was talking about what an alpha male is and talking about how very difficult it is to define an alpha male, he gave the example of like Corey Worthington to try and grab for just a few minutes this picture of not caring. And I think he missed the mark a little bit. I've seen so many men online attempt to define or identify or diagnose other men as being alpha or not alpha based on some video or some quote or some statement that they've seen of these men. And the truth is, alpha is so difficult to define because alpha is not solely one set of behaviors. So you can't look at a guy being aggressive or a guy who is being silent or a guy who is being outspoken. You can't look at any single trait and say, oh, that guy is definitely alpha. It's one of those things that, as many people have said, you know it when you see it. But it's not so clear to define. I think the reason it's not so clear to define is because a large part of being alpha is being integrated. And so when Glover talks about integration in a man, that is what makes the man alpha. That's what people respond to. I've seen so many men who will look at some guy and say, well, he's alpha or he's not alpha because of some little thing that he says or some little thing that he does. Men can do this, men can't do that. Well, if you're going to be alpha, you have to do this. There's the no true Scotsman argument of alphaness where, well, no true alpha would do, name anything. And the thing they all seem to fail to understand is a man who is fully integrated, a man who has all these traits aligned and set in order in his life, he doesn't need to follow any set protocol or set group of rules in order to be alpha. He is. He has achieved it. It's there. He simply exists. And he's not always outwardly showing it at everybody, but it's still there. And so a man who doesn't necessarily look immediately and strikingly alpha is still, can be very alpha. It's very difficult to look particularly alpha when you're eating your breakfast or brushing your teeth. It's not something you're displaying all the time, but it's still there. It's a part of who you are. And I think integration is probably the best way to define it that I've seen yet, because it takes something that is intangible and makes it understandable and relatable. A man who has achieved an integration of himself, a sense of balance within himself, an understanding of who he is he can be truly alpha. And if he's failed to do that, then, he can act any old way he wants to, but it's always a performance. Women are looking for that man. The man just described right here, this guy. They're looking for that man. And that man isn't a bad boy, and he isn't a nice guy. He's an entire third category, and that's what we want. There are plenty of women who can get very easily distracted by nice guys or bad boys, frequently bad boys, not so much nice guys. But at the end of the day, what we really, really want is an everything man. And this is the everything man. If you are currently in a relationship, I encourage you to ask your partner to read this book along with you. The program of recovery represented in No More Mr. Nice Guy will significantly affect you, as well as those closest to you. Though your partner may be supportive of you making positive changes, they may also initially frighten him or her. Reading this book together can help facilitate this transition. Good. It's actually very encouraging. I understand why there are a lot of guys who don't want to share the red pill with their partners, or if they become red pilled while they're in a relationship, they don't want to talk about it with their partners. I can understand why it's very difficult to discuss. Well, it's sexually red pilled. I know there are other ways to be red pilled, but sexually red pilled. I know it can be very difficult to discuss these ideas and concepts with a partner. However, especially if it's a long-term relationship, it can be really helpful to, kind of keep your partner in the loop. And it's good that this book is material that can be used to keep a partner in the loop. Like, if this book is claiming to be the kind of material that a guy can share with his, significant other to kind of help clarify what's going on as he changes his life around, preferably, hopefully for the better, that's wonderful. That can be very, very reassuring. And so, definitely if you are the kind of guy who's reading this book, or you're the partner of the kind of guy reading this book, I've only read one chapter, but if he's saying that this is going to help, and given the quality of the first chapter, I'm kind of inclined to believe him, this might be something that you would want to read to kind of help you, clarify any questions that might come up along the way. I think that's very encouraging, and it's a hell of a lot better than the idea of just maintaining secrecy, because secrecy can be really scary for a significant other, especially someone who cares about you, like genuinely cares about you. So that's awesome. Anyway, this was the first chapter, and I loved it. I thought it was really good. I think Mystery Method got really dry for me. And I know it was an old book, but it really helped introduce me to a lot of PUA ideas and terms, like original PUA ideas and terms. I know it's grown and morphed since then, which is encouraging, because Mystery Method was not a lot to go on. I'm actually really happy with this book because, well, number one, it's not about manipulating people into going to bed with you, which is nice. Ideally, they want to go to bed with you and you don't have to do any kind of manipulation. But also, it's much more self-focused. It's much more about self-improvement. Do women do horrible things? Yes. Yes, they do. Do women ride the cock carousel and then expect men to take responsibility for their failings and misdeeds? Yes. Do women do horrible things? Yes. There are women out there who do horrible things. Naywalt, not all women are doing horrible things, and not all women do all horrible things. So there are some women who do lots of horrible things, and some women who do a couple of horrible things, and some women who don't really do many horrible things at all. If they do anything, it's kind of not really horrible. It might be a little bit not nice. And then there are some women who are saints, and one of these days I might run into one of them. I might have run into one of them already and simply not recognized it. But the thing that I really like about this book is that it is not so other-focused. It's not it's not as inclined to take on this victim mentality that I sometimes see in red pill groups where men throw blame on women and kind of use it as this excuse to not necessarily take a very close look at themselves. It's, obviously it's a self-help book, yeah, but it's much more directed at what are the mistakes you're making and how do you fix those, as opposed to let's just blame these other people over here and act like a victim. I prefer that way of seeing the world. There are occasions that you will be victimized, but generally speaking, it is much better to look at the variables that you can control. If you can control things about yourself and turn those parts of yourself, those pieces of yourself, not necessarily things you do or things about yourself, but things about how you have yourself organized as a person. If you can control that and tidy that up and make that better, then you've accounted for the variables that are under your own control. And then if someone out there in the world does something terribly shitty to you, that's horribly shitty luck. And you do need to be wary about people in the outside world. But you're not looking at the world through this victimhood lens of, things are bad, things are terrible, woe is me. It's all those other people that are causing all my problems. If you can control something, then you have a sense of control. And then you have a sense of power. And then you're not a victim anymore. And that's important. So, yeah, I really like this book, and I can't wait to read the next chapter. I'll talk to you guys later.